No one in Red Fern Valley ever forgot the look in Jonas Hale's eyes that night at the Work for Shelter auction. The kind of look a man wore when he'd already seen too much of life to be surprised by its cruelty, but was still half ready to fight it anyway. They didn't see the years of war behind that stare, the nights he'd kept watch over sleeping comrades knowing dawn might never come. They only saw a war-hardened ranger standing in the corner, hat brim low, waiting for the evening to end. And that's when the council decided to have their little joke. They laughed when they called Maggie Rae Collins forward, a poor woman with patched skirts and bare feet, and gifted her to him like a stray pup no one else wanted. They thought it would break him, or her. What happened instead would silence their laughter for good. If you believe a man's worth isn't measured by the coins in his pocket, but by the steel in his soul, you might want to stick around. And if you do, make sure you like and subscribe, because this is the kind of story that deserves to be told all the way to the end. Jonas didn't move at first. He just stood there, shadowed against the back wall of the town hall, hands hooked in his belt, his rifle leaning against the corner behind him. The crowd was restless. Most of them gathered for the auction's real purpose, trading short-term labor to help needy ranchers before winter set in. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet wool, the floorboards creaking under boots that had seen too many muddy pastures. Maggie stood on the platform, chin high, refusing to drop her gaze even as the men at the front smirked and traded jabs about how she'd fetch less than a lame mule. Her eyes were bright, defiant, and I swear you could see the spark in them all the way to the back of the room. Jonas was a man used to weighing risks. He'd measured the range between himself and a hostile marksman in the mountains of New Mexico. He'd tracked raiding parties through dust storms thick enough to strip a man's skin raw. So he took his time looking her over, not in the crude way the others did, but like he was measuring her stance, the set of her shoulders, the stubborn stillness in her posture. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't asking for pity. She looked, in fact, like she was daring someone, anyone, to try and tell her what she was worth. The bidding began low, almost mocking, and it was clear no one meant to offer enough to make it worth the council's while. Jonas pushed off the wall, his boots making a dull thud on the pine planks as he walked toward the front. The murmuring started before he even opened his mouth. People knew his history, knew he'd walked away from the Rangers with a chest full of medals and a head full of ghosts. They also knew he'd been living alone on his spread out past the ridge, his only company a dog that wouldn't let anyone else close, and a herd of cattle too wild for most hands to manage. 50, he said, his voice steady but carrying enough weight to cut through the chatter. The room went still for a heartbeat, then the laughter began in earnest. $50 was more than anyone had paid all night, and for Maggie Rae Collins, they thought it was madness. A few men nudged each other, whispering about how maybe the war had left the ranger touched in the head. Maggie didn't smile, didn't flinch, just kept her eyes locked on Jonas as if she were trying to read whatever it was that had made him speak up. Sold, the auctioneer said quickly, eager to close the deal before Jonas changed his mind. Jonas walked to the platform, unhurried, and extended a calloused hand to help her down. She hesitated for only a moment before taking it, her fingers small but firm in his grip. Up close, he could see the freckles across her nose, the windburn on her cheeks, the faint shadow of hollows where hunger had made its mark. He also saw the way she stood her ground when they faced each other, like someone who had spent her life weathering storms no one else could see. The ride to his ranch was silent for the first mile, the wagon wheels crunching over frost-hardened earth. The sky above them was a deep indigo, scattered with stars, the air sharp enough to bite through wool. Jonas drove with his shoulders squared, one hand light on the reins, the other resting near the rifle in the rack beside him, a habit he'd never shaken from years of patrol. Maggie sat beside him, her hands tucked into the folds of her threadbare shawl, watching the road ahead like she'd memorized every bend and turn. "You don't have to keep me," she said finally, her voice low but clear. "I know this was a joke to them." Jonas didn't glance at her. "Wasn't a joke to me." She studied his profile for a long moment, maybe searching for the lie in it, but found nothing. Then why? He flicked the reins lightly, urging the team into a smoother gait. "Because I need someone who won't scare easy. Someone who knows how to work and doesn't quit. You've got that look." A dry laugh escaped her. "That's a lot to gamble on a look." "I've gambled on less," he said, and that was the end of it. When they reached the ranch, The wind had picked up, whistling through the cottonwoods by the creek. The house stood dark and solid against the horizon, its logs weathered silver gray by years of storms. He helped her down, and she took in the outbuildings, the corral, the stacked woodpile under the eaves. Practical signs of a man who planned to survive winter without asking anyone's help. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and pine. A fire burned low in the hearth, throwing shadows against the plank walls. Jonas showed her the small bedroom off the main room, the bed neatly made with a quilt that looked older than both of them. "You can have this space," he said. "We'll work out the rest as we go." She stepped inside, running a hand over the worn quilt like she was testing its truth. "And if I don't work out, then you leave come spring," he replied, his voice even. "No one owes anyone anything. But until then, it's your home." For a long moment, she just stood there, the firelight catching in her eyes, and Jonas thought again of that look she'd worn on the auction platform, defiant, unbroken. Whatever storms had carved her down to the bone, she was still standing. And for the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something other than duty or survival. Something that might just make this gamble worth the price he'd paid. The first real snow came early that year, drifting down in slow, heavy flakes that muffled the world to a hush. It settled on the fence posts like white caps, turned the cottonwood branches into silvered lace, and made the air taste clean and sharp. Out on the high pastures, the cattle moved slow and deliberate, their hides dusted in white, steam curling from their nostrils. Jonas stood at the corral, collar turned up against the wind, watching the herd the way some men watch the horizon for trouble. He'd told Maggie on her first morning here that winter on the plains could make or break a person. You either learned to work with it, or it would swallow you whole. She'd just nodded, tied her hair back with a strip of faded calico, and asked which fence line needed mending first. From that day forward, Maggie worked as if the land had always been hers. She rose before the sun, moving through the cold kitchen with a kind of quiet efficiency that made the place feel different, warmer somehow. The coffee was always ready when Jonas came in from the pre-dawn chores, its bitter steam mingling with the smell of biscuits baking in the wood stove. She mended shirts without being asked, cut kindling from logs too knotted for Jonas's saw, and kept the fire steady even through the worst of the windstorms. But it wasn't just the work. It was the way she seemed to fold herself into the rhythms of the ranch without fuss or complaint, the way her presence filled up spaces Jonas hadn't realized were empty. Still, there were moments when the silence between them felt like a gulf. Jonas had lived alone so long, spoken so little beyond the necessary. That conversation came to him like an unfamiliar trail, full of unexpected turns. Maggie wasn't much for idle chatter either. They spoke when they needed to, and sometimes when they didn't, but there was a carefulness to it, as if they were both waiting to see if this arrangement would hold once the novelty wore off. That test came sooner than either of them expected. It was a clear, brittle morning when Jonas rode down to the south pasture and found boot prints in the snow, too many for a lone rider, and too fresh to be from days past. He followed them far enough to see where they'd cut across his land toward the ridge, the marks deep and purposeful. When he came back, his jaw was set like stone. "We've got company," he told Maggie as he stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. Her hands paused over the dough she was kneading. The kind that knocks on the door, or the kind that waits until you're looking the other way? The second kind. That was when she learned about Silas Creedy, a name spoken in the valley with the same wariness folks used for rattlesnakes and dry wells. Creedy had been a supply runner during the war, the sort of man who could find anything for a price and double the price if you were desperate enough. Jonas had crossed paths with him more than once on patrol, never liking the way Creedy's eyes seemed to measure every man for weakness. After the war, Creedy had drifted west, buying up struggling homesteads for pennies and leaving a trail of bad debts and missing livestock in his wake. Maggie listened without flinching, then went back to kneading the dough. "If he's sniffing around here, it's not for the scenery." "No," Jonas agreed. "It's for the water rights." The spring-fed creek that ran through Jonas's property was worth more than gold in a dry season. Creedy had been trying to buy up every source of fresh water for 20 miles, and Jonas's land was the last piece he needed. The next afternoon, Creedy himself rode in with 2 men. He was dressed better than most. Long black coat, silver watch chain glinting against his vest, But his smile was too smooth, his handshake too quick. "Jonas," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Heard you've taken a wife. Congratulations." His eyes slid toward Maggie, and Jonas felt his hand tighten involuntarily on the reins. "State your business," Jonas said flatly. "Straight to it, then." Preety's smile widened. "I'll give you a fair price for this spread. More than fair. Enough to set you and the missus up anywhere you like. Warmer, safer, without all this hard labor." Jonas didn't answer right away. He just looked at Preety, the silence stretching until it became its own kind of refusal. When he finally spoke, it was with a voice as steady as the wind through the grass. "Not for sale." Something in Preety's eyes hardened, but the smile stayed fixed. "Think on it, Hale. Winter's only just started. Be ashamed to waste your strength on a fight you can't win." After they left, Maggie came to stand beside Jonas at the porch rail. The snow was falling again, soft and silent, blurring the tracks Preety's horses had left behind. "He's not going to stop," she said. "I know." She folded her arms, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then I guess we don't stop either." It wasn't said like a promise. It was said like a fact, plain and unshakable. The way a person might say the sun rises in the east or that water runs downhill. Jonas turned to look at her then. Really look at her. Not just the strong lines of her face or the way she met his eyes without blinking, but the steel beneath it all. And in that moment, he knew the council's joke had given him more than a wife. It had given him an ally. That night, he set a second rifle by the door. Preety came back in the thaw, when the snowmelt turned the dirt road into a ribbon of mud, and the creek roared high with spring water. This time, he didn't come with smooth words or offers on paper. He came with 4 armed men, riding hard and straight for the ranch. Jonas was already in the yard when they appeared over the rise, his rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. Maggie stood on the porch with the second gun, her skirts pulled back, eyes narrowed against the sun. "Last chance, Hale," Preety called, reining in just short of the fence. "Sign over the water rights, and we ride away. Don't, and you won't like how this ends." Jonas's voice carried across the yard, low and steady. "You've had your answer since winter." The first shot came from Preety's side, a warning, maybe, or maybe meant to spook them. It didn't matter. Jonas's rifle barked once, splintering the post inches from the man's leg. Then the air was filled with gunfire and shouts, the smell of powder stinging the cold spring air. Maggie fired from the porch with a precision that made Jonas's chest tighten, steady hands, calm breathing, each shot sending Preety's men scrambling for cover. It didn't last long. Preety hadn't counted on the neighbors, the ones who'd quietly taken sides through the winter. Riders came hard from the tree line. Dr. Morrison, the McKay brothers, even Reverend Briggs with a shotgun, hemmed them in from the rear. Surrounded and outnumbered, Preety knew the fight was lost. He spat in the mud, glaring at Jonas and Maggie like a man memorizing a grudge, then turned his horse and rode off into the hills, his men trailing after him. The valley was quiet again, save for the wind in the grass and the creek's rush. Jonas lowered his rifle and looked toward the porch. Maggie was there, cheeks flushed, hair loose from its pins, breathing hard but smiling like she'd just carved her place into the land with her own 2 hands. Years later, folks would still talk about that day. By then, the ranch would be bigger, the fences straighter, the creek still running clear. And 3 tall sons would ride its borders, broad-shouldered boys with their father's steady eyes and their mother's unshakable will, fierce enough to guard the land, and wise enough to know what it had cost to keep it. And when people remembered how it started, they no longer laughed about the poor woman gifted to a war-hardened ranger. They said instead that Jonas Hale had been the luckiest man in Red Fern Valley, because Maggie Rae Collins hadn't just given him a home. She'd given him a future.